The final talk of the morning session, which is being given by Dr. Henry Burridge, who's a lecturer in civil and environmental engineering at Imperial College London. Henry has played a very active role in the ramp, in this task of ramp over the last year, leading a group on the role of ventilation and exhalation, and in particular being the lead author on a publication of our findings in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, published about a month ago. So over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, it's a great honour actually to be speaking after Lydia and Kath, who have set up my talk excellently. And it's very much about looking to the future of ventilation and leveraging the interest in the pandemic to measure ventilation and more widely and monitor this. And it's owed a lot to a very wide cohort of collaborators. So I don't think I need to say this, but the names in bold are what the WHO would call these infection routes. I think, I tend to think of this route as a spray route and don't distinguish, as Lydia said, between size of particle and I reserve airborne to really think about the far field transmission, where air currents have to play a meaningful role in the transport of infectious particles from one person to another, and that happens when it happens indoors. That's obviously drastically affected by the indoor airflows, and that's determined to a leading order by ventilation flows. So thanks to Lydia, I really don't need to say this, and to Kath, of course. I think one positive thing to say is that, only this month ASHRAE came out with a really strong statement about how we need to control transmission by ventilation. And I think that's when we have international agencies like that making those statements, that's significant progress, in no small part due to the two ladies that have already spoken today. So, as Lydia said, we need to mitigate all routes because airborne transmission happens. So when we're thinking about mitigating airborne infection, our primary line of defense should be to increase our ventilation. But what's an appropriate level of ventilation? It can be challenging. I think this is the only reason in my mind why it hasn't been more at the forefront of international mitigation strategies, is because it's difficult. But that's not an excuse for not trying. And it is true that if you have adequate ventilation, then increasing ventilation further doesn't help risk that much and wastes a lot of energy. So I think the first thing we need to do is actually work out what ventilation levels we have already. And I think that is crucial for CO2 monitoring, can play a very important role in that. And I think, that hasn't changed because of COVID. It's just been highlighted more. And so perhaps we do need to motivate this positive change via the pandemic, as well as help to mitigate the pandemic. And increasing ventilation, particularly if this happens in the longer term, has implications. We might be trying to reduce risk, but we might end up using a huge amount of energy to keep everyone comfortable, and that's not something that's good for us as a society at all. So if we want to think about what's an adequate level of ventilation we need to assess the risk. And as Kath said, you know, I think particularly in the case of COVID-19, we really need to think about dose response models, because it seems to be a very complex disease. It's very over dispersed, but that is work in progress. And so to date, we've focused on using Wells-Riley type approaches, and that relies on parameterizing the infection process of the disease by the quanta generation rate, and that value varies dependent on disease, and it also varies on respiratory and physical activities. I'm going to use values that Lydia was involved in producing for SARS-CoV-2, and we can talk about values if you really must at the end. But if we look at the Wells-Riley, it tells us the likelihood of infection is 1 minus this exponential, and I think of this exponential as being the product of 4 parameters. The percentage or the fraction of the room that's infected people over a total number of people, the breathing rate over the per person ventilation supply times by the quanta rate, and our time interval. And that sort of highlights that in addition to knowing our quanta generation rate, we're really left with 3 significant issues for deployment. We don't often know what the ventilation rates actually are, and they're not constant, and this is the original sort of formulation, if you like, and it's a steady state version. Occupants typically come and go from a space, certainly during the day and quite possibly during the time interval of exposure that we're looking to assess. And then the length over which we're trying to determine the risk obviously changes the likelihood of infection, but it also drastically changes the gradient, so how quickly people are likely to become infected. So I was really very inspired by Rudnick and Milton's work, which reformulated the Wells-Riley equation in terms of the fraction of rebreathed air, and where human breathing is the dominant source of CO2. It's a sort of simple mass balance that tells you that you can easily assess the fraction of rebreathed air based on measurements of the CO2. And so that means we can measure our fraction of rebreathed air very easily in any space where human breathing is the dominant source. And they reformulated the terms in the exponential, the sort of parameterization of the environment, if you like, as an integral of the rebreathed fraction over time. And that meant that it could be deployed for transient environments where the environmental conditions are monitored. So that kind of knocks out one of our 3 significant issues. We did some work and thought about things, and certainly in the case that you're trying to make predictions about how infections might occur in a given space, then it's fair to assume every occupant is equally likely to be infected, and then you can move this fraction of people infected inside the integral, and now you can use the model on variable occupancy spaces, and that's helpful. And then for the third issue, what we thought about was, during the pandemic, anyone who's got symptoms is staying away. So in the worst case, we could assess a space over a duration which a pre or asymptomatic infectious person kept attending. So that's about 5 working days for COVID. And you can only really think about that in regularly attended spaces like an open plan office or a classroom, where Monday to Friday the same people come and go each day. And you're looking then, of course, that not at the probability that one of them becomes infected, but the probability that somebody comes infected within that space. So you're looking really from an environmental perspective rather than a sort of population perspective, as would be more traditional in epidemiology. So you can deploy this very easily on modelled offices, where you model the production of people's breath, and we did that in a sort of typical open plan office and let people come and go each day in a sort of reasonable fashion. And we considered a number of ventilation scenarios, and as a base case, we considered the case that the space was ventilated in line with UK guidance, which is 10 litres per second per person. And if you think that everyone in the space is carrying out quiet desk-based work, then your quanta rates are really quite low, and your corresponding probability, this red line, is also quite low. But if you just change one thing, for example, you imagine now that you're thinking about a call center where a lot of people are on the phone all the time, then your quanta rate changes quite drastically, as does the likelihood of infection. But the model's main strength is that it uses monitored data, and so we had some, we got access to some data, and in this office, 6 CO2 monitors were located, occupancy was recorded, and it had desks for 6 people, and that's data is thanks to the MAGIC project. And so here we have, this is Windows, when windows were open, in the left-hand column, and in the right-hand column a day when windows remained closed. And the occupancy is similar on both days. The CO2 level, no surprise, is elevated on the day when the windows are closed, and the risk is roughly doubled when the windows are closed. What's interesting to note is when the windows are open, you see a much wider variation. So the ventilation flow is creating a wide dispersion in CO2 levels around the room. And you can again look at a 5-day period, and you end up with a sort of infection risk in this space of about 6%, and you can decide whether that's significant or not. And we've also been looking at school classrooms. So this is the data from a classroom that was refurbished quite recently, so it had reasonable ventilation provision. And these are the sort of secondary infection numbers that you'd expect, much lower in the summer months and much higher in the winter months. And we got hold of some data from 45 classrooms monitored over a nearly 5-year period pre-pandemic, and we found that, broadly speaking, the risks in winter months are double those in summer, just because of the inferred changes in ventilation. Paul mentioned this publication, and I'll just put it here in case people are interested in reading it. and it covers a whole range of mitigation strategies. It's a very broad focus to the paper, so I recommend reading it, but I would, wouldn't I? And so just in conclusion, I think you've already been told a number of times today that airborne infection could be significant, and I think we need to be very wary of that as we re-establish shared indoor spaces. I think if we're thinking about places that are well ventilated, we may not need to panic. We need to think very carefully of how they're used. But the crucial thing in my mind is we need to work out where we are poorly ventilating spaces and address these. If we don't, then airborne infections, when we start to open up, could be an issue. The complexity of the disease is, you've seen from Kath that the Skagit choir quanta numbers are enormous, and really understanding that, why that's appropriate in the choir, but not in the majority of other spaces and events needs further work. And we need to think about how airborne transmission or airborne exposure might couple with other exposure routes. So, particularly as we come into summer, it's an easy message to send, let's open more windows. When we come into next winter, we had a lot of cold children in the UK because classrooms had all their windows open, and we need to think how to balance that. And that in terms of the infection risk can be very much helped, the airborne infection risk can be very much helped with monitored CO2, and we'd recommend more widespread monitoring. I'm just going to ask one question in the last 2 minutes, and say, is it scientific to make assessments based on point measurements of gaseous scalar? And I think there's two main things that people throw at that. Is you're measuring a gas versus respiratory aerosols, and we're part of some work that's being led by Kath on this to really understand when it matters that they're aerosols and droplets, and when it is valid to use gaseous markers. And then the other question is, during you're taking point measurements in a space which is not well mixed, and inferring the likelihood of infection from somebody emitting at a point in space. And we're working on that with a project that Paul and other people from RAMP are involved in. And I'll just talk very quickly about a model classroom, naturally ventilated. We have 30 children and 2 adults. It's winter time, so we have some heating on to generate a comfortable temperature, and the flow ends up at about 8 litres a second per person, so probably a little bit above average for a UK classroom, below guidance for a UK office though. And then we have a sort of these people are represented by a distributed source of CO2 inputting CO2 across the room at a height appropriate for a children's breathing zone, and then we have them emitting infected breath. So if we just look at the CO2 distribution in the breathing plane, we can see that the flow creates regions of high and low concentrations, and in our low concentrations the excess CO2 might be as low as 250 ppm, and in our high regions up to about 1000 ppm. So the excess CO2 in this simulation, and we're testing lots of other flow patterns, might be around 4, up to around 4, with most of the room following a much narrower distribution. Crucially, your measurements at the wall, where we take CO2 measurements typically, are broadly representative of levels in the interior, and that's a very good thing. And then we're using everyone's CO2 as a proxy for exposure to a single infector. And so we've been thinking about the exposure ratio, so the exposure you get to an actual infector's breath relative to the exposure you'd infer by measuring the total CO2. We're thinking about the far field, so we're not in their personal space, just 1 meter away, and this exposure ratio can get up to sort of 2 to 4. So you'd be underestimating the risk by a factor of 2 to 4 in that at those locations. But in most of the room, 90% of it, it's the exposure ratio is less than 2, and else where the majority of the room, the exposure ratio indicates you're being slightly conservative by taking CO2 measurements. So my final point is that you can make point measurements of CO2 at the wall, and they are representative of the breathing plane, and we need to understand the uncertainty that's associated with those because of the flow field. But then we can also think about the exposure to an infector, and doing so doesn't introduce a risk beyond the uncertainty of the parameterization of COVID itself. So that's a very useful finding. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Henry. Great talk. I just we're running slightly short of time, but I'm going to cut the questions down slightly, but there are 2 interesting ones, I think. Well, there are more, but I'm going to restrict it to 2. Do the current studies show the impact of masks on lowering infection risk in combination with ventilation rates?
Yes, there's a lot of studies where people have accounted for masks in various ways, and these can be incorporated into these types of models very easily, yeah.
Okay, and the second question from Kath to you. What are the implications for CO2 monitoring of the fact that the concentration could be more than double in some locations? Are we inadvertently calling rooms risky or safe?
Yeah, I think the answer is possibly. We don't know yet. I mean, in the worst case, we're overutilizing the information, and I think the key thing is that we probably need to have uncertainty bounds on our measurements. People sort of get all uppity about how accurate is your CO2 sensor. Well, frankly, as long as it's a sensible measuring technique like NDIR, it's probably not your leading order of uncertainty. Where you position the sensor probably is. So we need to think carefully about that. But I don't think that's a barrier to doing it. I don't think we should not deploy sensors because we're not 100% certain as to the exact flow field. Any information is better than none.
Yep. Thank you very much, Henry. And I'd like to thank all our 3 speakers for a fascinating morning, Kath, Lydia, and Henry. We're now going to move on to the poster session, and I believe that Claire is going to tell us what we should do.